Welcome to San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, located in Georgetown, Texas. Our mission is to welcome all, promote personal and spiritual growth, and work for a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. To find out more about us, check out our website at www.sangabrieluu.org. And if you would like, sign up for our weekly newsletter, The Messenger. There you will find links for all of our virtual activities. We are a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association. More about our organization can be found at www.uua.org. Our guest speaker today is the Reverend Art Severance. Art has retired after almost 30 years in ministry and has returned to San Antonio, where he served as the minister for the First UU Church for 16 years. He was recently named Minister Emeritus. Originally from New Hampshire, he has been married to his wife, Kathy, since 1973, has 3 married daughters and 5 grandchildren. He has served congregations in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, California, Colorado, Texas, New York, and Ohio, either as an interim, part or full-time or developmental minister. He has served in Texas on the Old District Board, given the Sunset Talks at SWUUSI in 1999. Served as a representative on the Old District's Ministerial Settlement, and currently serves on the board of UU Retired Ministers and Partners Association. He is also a folk singer and songwriter and has a CD available titled Listen to the Whirlwind. Have you ever tried to explain what you believe as a Unitarian Universalist and been met with a blank stare or considered a heretic? This Sunday, Reverend Art Severance will lead us to consider our heretical history. He will be presenting the first of his 2-part sermon today. What do UUs believe? It all depends. He will again grace our pulpit on March 28th. My name is Pam Hibbard, and I am a proud member of San Gabriel. I hope you find today's service enjoyable and stimulating.
We kindle the flame of this chalice because we seek the light of love for all humanity, the light of religion which is universal, the light of holiness called by many names, the light of justice for all people, the light of peace for all countries in the world, the light of hope which we must never cease to preach, the light of forgiveness, that we may forgive others even as we may be forgiven, and the light of beloved community gathered to worship. Good morning. It's good to be here with you again. The song I'd like to sing for you this morning is Shall We Gather by the River, a gospel song that was originally written by Robert Lowry in 1864, or at least the tune was. But the words were adapted or written by my friend John Hook, who is the music director at the fellowship where I first served way back in the old days. He wrote this in 1989 at Bucksmont Unitarian Universalist Fellowship outside of, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Shall we gather by the river in a circle made of love, sharing, caring, helping, being as the rain falls from above? Yes, we'll gather by the river, beautiful, beautiful river. Yes, we'll gather by the river to build a community of love. Drops of rain fall in the river, blending with the gentle flow. As we reach to touch each other, we can feel our spirits grow. Yes, we'll gather by the river, beautiful, beautiful river. Gather with our friends by the river to build a fellowship of love. Storm and lightning on the river, storm and conflict test our love. Now there's strength in the river, understanding builds our love. Yes, we'll gather by the river, beautiful, beautiful river. Gather with our friends by the river to build a community of love. Mother, she bears a river, Father, Sonny makes it flow. Bind our spirits with the river, and the web of life we grow. Yes, we'll gather by the river, beautiful, beautiful river. Gather with our friends by the river to build a fellowship of love. Yes, hear the opening words. These are from the 10 Suggestions for a Healthy Congregation by my colleague, the Reverend Dean Starr. Always be kind to one another, even if you think meanness is justified. 2, always attribute the best possible motives to one another, even when you do not understand how one another's words or actions. 3, promise to one another only what you really intend and are capable of delivering. 4, laugh and cry together, sharing both your joys and your heartaches. 5, be very quick to praise one another and very slow to criticize. 6, defend one another but avoid being defensive. 7, accept one another's gifts with gratitude, accept one another's deficiencies with grace. 8, do not tell one another how to feel. Remember that feelings are facts and treat them accordingly. 9, greet each new day with expectation and each hour of rest with thanksgiving. And 10, let your eyes light up when you come into one another's presence.
Please join me as we say our affirmation together. The doctrine of this church is love. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls may grow in harmony with the divine. Thus we do covenant with each other.
Hello. I'd like to tell you a story about how the Unitarians invented air. I have a whole series about how Unitarians or Universalists invented things, and this is about how we invented air. You might have heard about this. It's a little stretch. You see, we didn't exactly invented air because air was there all along, of course. But there was a scientist named Joseph Priestley who was from England, and he was also Unitarian. He was a Unitarian minister as well as being a scientist. And he did experiments on oxygen. Before this time, people didn't realize that there was something called oxygen. They just kind of knew that they breathed something they didn't know it was. Well, he finally discovered that there was something separate that was called oxygen. And he figured out how to put it in a bottle and all this other stuff. And he realized that that's what we breathe. We breathe oxygen. And eventually, of course, we were able to use that for things like helping us breathe if we're sick. He also you can inject it in different things to make carbonation. So not only did he invent air, that's what I like to call it, but he started something where you can make carbonation. And so he invented soda. Well, he didn't actually invent it, but he made that possible. And then things like refrigeration, etc. And I like to think it's because Unitarians tend to think a lot, and they try to experiment. They don't just take it for granted. They just try to do things. And so he did that as well. So Joseph Priestley, a Unitarian, invented or discovered the idea of oxygen. And he discovered something else that I like to think might even be just as important, especially to school children, especially in the early grades, but to all grades when you stop to think about it. He invented the eraser. That's right. He invented the eraser. Imagine going to school without an eraser. I can't imagine it, tell you. I need the eraser more than most people, I think. He invented it somehow in a gum plant. Because he used to have to invent, when ink, you had to blot it and stuff, and it was hard. Somehow he had a piece of gum, rubber gum, and he used that to try to blot out something, and he noticed that it erased things. And so he started working with that in chemicals and that's when, and he finally worked out something that made things that erased the something on his paper. And he eventually got it so that it was like an eraser. So not only did he invent air, he invented the eraser. Isn't that amazing? The end. The reading this morning comes from William Channing Gannett, a Unitarian minister, and it's part of the Western Conference. And Western, obviously, as opposed to Boston, which was the heart of Unitarianism at the time. In 1887, the Western Conference adopted a statement by William Channing Gannett called "Things Commonly Believed Among Us." This is not an inclusive language, which the author David Robinson describes in his wonderful book, highly recommended, by the way, called The Unitarians and the Universalists. as one of the most moving and accurate statements of faith among Unitarianism at that time. We believe that to love the good and live the good is a supreme thing in religion. We hold reason and conscience to be final authorities of religious belief. We honor the Bible and all inspiring scripture, old or new. We revere Jesus and all holy souls that have taught men truth and righteousness and love as prophets of religion. We trust the unfolding universe as beautiful, beneficent, unchanging order. To know this order is truth, to obey it is right, and liberty and stronger life. We believe that good and evil inevitably carry their own recompense. We believe that we ought to join hands and work to make the good things better, and the worst good, counting nothing good for self that is not good for all. We believe that this self-forgetting, loyal life awakes in man that sense of union here and now with things eternal, the sense of deathlessness, and this sense to us is an earnest of a life to come. And we worship one in all, that life whence suns and stars derive their orbits, and the soul of man its ought, that light which lighteth every man that cometh unto the world, giving us power to become the sons of God, that love with whom our souls commune. And this one we name the eternal God, our Father. After I wrote my sermon, I realized I hadn't mentioned much about women in the 19th century, and it's because there weren't many women ministers at that time writing theology. And so I wanted to, before I started the sermon, actually read a list of some of the famous women of the 19th century, and I think you will see why, starting with, of course, Louisa May Alcott, the very famous writer, perhaps the most famous, especially woman writer of the 19th century, who obviously the author of Little Women, who is still read highly today. The book has never gone out of print and is still one of the huge favorites among women today, and especially young girls. So Louisa May Alcott, her father Bronson was also a very famous Unitarian kind of philosopher, but not known much today. Lydia Marie Child, probably most known for her wonderful Thanksgiving song, Over the River and Through the Woods, but she was also an abolitionist, a women's and Native American rights advocate, and started a children's magazine. She was quite a writer in her own time. Emily Dickinson, of course, the famous poet. Margaret Fuller, who was also one of the Transcendentalists, the only woman in that group. She was the editor of a Transcendentalist magazine called The Dial, and became the first newspaper feature writer for Horace Greeley, the Universalist, of the New York Tribune, and then became its first foreign correspondent, who covered the revolution in Italy and unfortunately died on her way back with her husband, who was one of the revolutionaries, and her new child. Beatrix Potter, who, of course, you know as the illustrator and writer of the Bunny Rabbit stories. But she was also a scientist. She was a natural scientist and a conservationist and an illustrator, very well-known illustrator at the time. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who was perhaps the first Gothic novelist and or science fiction novelist, and wrote the famous novel Frankenstein. There was Elizabeth Parker Peabody, who was the person who brought the idea of kindergarten to this country from Germany. She was very well known in her time, and started the Boston group with women coming to talk about social issues of the day. Jane Addams, who was known for the start of social work and the Hull House in Chicago, helping women and other people in poverty. Clara Barton, of course, who was the nurse who helped start Red Cross. Maria Mitchell, who was the first female astronomer in the United States and the first American scientist of either gender to discover a comet. Florence Nightingale, the British nurse, who is known as the mother of modern nursing. Susan B. Anthony, of course, the suffragette and one of the founder of the women's movement in this country. Julia Ward Howe, another suffragette, abolitionist, writer, lecturer, and of course author of the Civil War anthem Battle Hymn of the Republic, but known as one of the co-founders of American women's suffrage, along with Mary Rice Livermore, who was also a reformer, abolitionist, and suffragette. And of course, a woman who I like to call my great-great-aunt, Caroline Severance, who originally was from Cleveland, married a banker, and actually Severance was his name, not her maiden name. But she was also an abolitionist, a suffragette, and she went to Boston, and while in Boston founded the Women's Club movement, which was very popular to this day. My mother in New Hampshire was president of the Women's Club in her area and was very active in that, as were both of my grandmothers. And it's still a very popular thing. She also became the vice president of Emerson's Free Religious Association later on, and founded the Los Angeles First Unitarian Church. Lucy Stone, another suffragette and abolitionist, living her life to battle inequality on all fronts, and the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. Judith Sargent Murray, who married John Murray, was one of the first women playwrights, and I think the first one to actually have a play published. She was an essay writer and a poet. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman in America to earn a medical degree. And then there were three women who competed for the rights to being the first known woman minister in this country. Olympia Brown, Universalist, known as the first woman minister whose ordination was recognized by a denomination. Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was the first woman of a recognized denomination as Congregationalist. And then Lydia Ann Jenkins, Universalist, who is now considered to be the actual first woman to be ordained by a denomination, according to some people. And I find that interesting because I also consider her a relative, since my grandmother's maiden name was Jenkins. So that's some of the famous women of the 19th century under UUism, and I'm sure I've left some out. So, a long history of heretics, part 1. Back before the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1961 and even after, there was some various religious competition, especially at the beginning, between the old Unitarians and the old Universalists, with the Universalists seen as more religious conservative and the Unitarians as those rational radicals. So the story goes, at least, there was an old Universalist who said to an old Unitarian, "You know, you Unitarians don't know much about the Bible. I'll bet you can't even say the Lord's Prayer from memory." And the Unitarian said, "I'll bet you $10 I can." So the Universalist said, "Okay, you're on." And the Unitarian started reciting, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." And the Universalist said, "Okay, you win, here's the $10. And the strange thing is, as we get along in years, some of the kids don't even realize what the joke is there. There's other stories, of course, about early Universalist preachers when he was preaching in the early 1800s, and elderly women supposedly inquired of Hosea Ballou whether he had the habit of asking his parishioners that line which was so popular at other Protestant churches, "O ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell?" And he responded in his typical laconic wit, "No, madam, that class of people do not attend my church." And then a similar event is supposed to have happened to a Unitarian clergy of similar time, only this time it was kind of a different section. A dowager came up to him and said, "Reverend, I noticed you never preach on the Trinity." And he replied, "That is correct, madam, and I never shall." And I want to be remembered for saying that my idea of hell is to be in a heaven for eternity that is full of fundamentalists. And actually, of course, almost any talk of heaven or hell in most Unitarian Universalist sermons is usually a sure sign that a punchline is coming up shortly. Well, Unitarians came out of the Congregationalist traditions, Congregationalists now being United Church of Christ, and tended to be more urban, educated, and upper class, more intellectual than spiritual often, and reason was valued highly, which was why the transcendentalist romanticism was originally suspect when that came along. They tended to see Jesus as separate from God and therefore rejected the idea of the Trinity, and salvation was by character, not by belief. The old joke was the difference between the Unitarians and the Universalists were that Unitarians believed that God was too good to condemn them to hell, and the Unitarians believed they were too good for God to condemn them to hell. Our history, our liberal religious heritage, is one really of constant religious evolution, primarily because at its heart was religious freedom, reason, tolerance, love, and the right to question literally everything. Working for social justice was always important, and our forebears would say that good works are more important than right belief. Most of us would go along with the statement of Freud's famous patient, Dr. Carl Jung, who said, "One of the main functions of formalized religion is to protect people against a direct experience of God," end quote. That is why, perhaps, that mystics of all religions were usually considered heretics themselves. Christianity was, it might be said, very loosely based on the teachings of Jesus, but more on the institution which developed political and religious doctrines that must be orthodox, developed and evolved from a Jewish cult to the dominant reign of the Roman Empire and emperor, and most of the founding, quote, fathers were obviously more Unitarian than they were what the fundamentalists would call today Christians. In fact, they were what today's fundamentalists would call heretics because they didn't believe in the Trinity. In fact, most were called deists, who were similar to humanists in that they did not believe in the traditional Christian God, but in a kind of far-away God that, like a clockmaker who makes the clock and then sets it down, has nothing more to do with it. Not much of a Christian doctrine. The Jewish cult of Jesus followers might actually have died out, except that the Emperor Constantine converted, though it might be debated whether it was for political or religious reasons. He was looking to unite the empire, but found when he actually brought the leaders of the church together to come up with a common denominator of beliefs, that there was kind of not complete agreement, and so he demanded one. He wanted a creed that would unite the empire, and so in 325 he called the Council of Nicaea. Perhaps you've heard something like the Nicene Creed. That was a result of it. Except that the priest named Arius believed that Jesus was not the same as God, though he was divine, that Jesus was created by God and therefore not the same as, and he was outvoted. And so in order to have the same as, he was banished later on to the barbarian type in Eastern Europe, where Unitarians and the name of heresy would later arise in places like Transylvania. And much later, in the 16th century, in the area of Poland, a man named Faustus Socinianus would take that one step further and claim that Jesus was fully human, divine by office, not by nature, and believe that the soul dies with the body except for those who have obeyed Jesus' commandments, who will be resurrected, and so forth. Those people were also called Unitarians, but they believed in this case that Jesus was fully human, and that was very different than Arius, though they both were called Unitarians. Those were primarily the European Unitarians, including, as they emigrated, the English Unitarians like Joseph Priestley, and the American Unitarians tended to be the Arian Unitarians, which would become problematic later on. Well, most of us left other traditions, and this tradition also left traditions. The 18th and 19th century were times of radical changes of philosophy and religion, science and politics, a time of revolution in so many ways. From his books on UU history, Challenge of a Liberal Faith, The writer George Marshall writes that in England during the 17th century, men like the poet John Milton, the philosopher John Locke, the physicist Isaac Newton fostered the Unitarian Church's growth. As the 18th century grew to a close, Joseph Priestley, who I mentioned, a Unitarian minister and the discoverer of oxygen, which I talked about in our children's story, was forced to flee the United States to escape the attack of mobs protesting his liberalism. Encouraged by Benjamin Franklin, he established the first actual named Unitarian church in this country in Northumberland, Pennsylvania in 1794. Soon after, the Boston-named King's Chapel left the Anglican fold to become Unitarian. And in 1802, the church founded by the Pilgrim Fathers, that first parish in Plymouth, became Unitarian. The Unitarians evolved out of the early Puritan, separatists, and congregational churches in New England. Many of the founding forebears were reluctant to even use that name at first, since it began as an insult hurled at us as a derogatory description. And in many cases, the ministers and majority of the churches would consider themselves anti-Trinitarian, but as the story I told earlier, they just didn't mention it. One of the books I often mention for UU history is another by UU historian Conrad Wright, and the book Three Prophets of Religious Liberalism, Channing, Emerson, and Parker. William Ellery Channing, especially, is sometimes called the father of American Unitarianism, lived from 1780 to 1842, and served the one church for almost 45 years. He was the minister of the Federal Street Church in Boston, now known as Arlington Street, the intellectual and spiritual leader of American Unitarianism, and an important and pervasive influence on New England transcendentalists as well, though died very soon after that really started. But in 1819, he gave a powerful and moving ordination sermon, actually in Baltimore, called Unitarian Christianity, that became a manifesto of sorts for American Unitarianism, and was the first time that those two words had been used together, at least in public and at least in a sermon. Because of those ideas that it was a slur, there still stands a statue of him on the corner of Boston Common, which says, "He breathed into theology a human spirit and proclaimed anew the divinity of man." What we would now say as humanity, and I would argue that we are still attempting to do that. In fact, it was not until 1825 that finally the American Unitarian Association was formed in the vestry of that church. They wanted him to be the first president, but he declined. No attempt was made to immediately issue any creedal requirements or start an autocracy. Instead, the leaders of that said, quote, "We value our doctrines only so far as they are evidently of the revelation of the will and character of God, and so far as they tend to improve the religious, moral, and intellectual condition of mankind. The great end of this association is the promotion of pure morals and practical piety," end quote. The second prophet was Emerson, and his Divinity School address of 1838 was his manifesto. I think that we can actually measure the beginning of modern UUism with that Divinity School address. To the Harvard Divinity School graduating class, many of whom, it said, were actually profoundly influenced by a commencement speech, which is rare, as most of us know. It might also be the beginnings of American transcendentalism, a topic for another time, but a forerunner of both the Beat Generation and hippies, I think. Emerson basically states his belief about Jesus this way. He said, "Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eyes the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravished by its beauty, he lived in it and had its being there. He saw that God incarnates himself in humanity and evermore goes forth the next and the following ages. The understanding caught this high chant from the poet's lips and said in the next age, This was Jehovah come down out of heaven, and I will kill you if you say he was a man. End quote. His speech was so radical that Harvard denounced it and didn't invite him back to speak for more than 25 years, though he became more and more famous as an intellectual giant. And this, in 1838, was after he had quit his pulpit, because he had found it too stifling even back then, especially the celebrating of the Lord's Supper, which he could no longer participate in, asking his board if he could be excused from celebrating it, which they denied, so he quit. He had found it repugnant, saying that Jesus was not one who required a blood sacrifice or a grisly, blood-drinking remembrance of it. And then in 1841 came Theodore Parker, another minister who denounced all of those things, and had been influenced by that address, as a matter of fact, and rattled the world with his sermon, called A Discourse on the Transient and the Permanent in Christianity, which made the radical statement which probably influenced Thoreau and progressives ever since. He said, the principle of morality is obedience to the law of conscience, end quote. A radical statement for even 1841. He then went on to reject all miracles, revelation, and said that the Bible was full of contradictions and mistakes, and suggested that to the people that it is not doctrinal but personal intuition that people should center their religious beliefs on, and on their individual experience. And this was too radical even for Unitarians, and especially even for his colleagues. And yet his congregation swelled. His supporters finally had to rent a music hall because there were too many people to fit in his church, and he ended up having thousands hearing him preach, being the first megachurch. And yet he died much too young at the age of 50. The abolitionist movement was full of both Unitarians and Universalists, although not nearly as many ministers as we would have liked to have seen. The Unitarians especially, oftentimes from very wealthy churches owned by owners of mills who needed that cotton. And it was said the Unitarian church bells would not ring for the abolitionists because they were stuffed with the cotton from the South. There was too much white privilege, you see. After the Civil War, Emerson helped start something called the Free Religious Association, trying to start something new beyond Unitarianism, and his vice president, as I said, was Caroline Severance. Some of the affirmations from the Free Religious Association in the 1860s. Religion is the effort of humanity to perfect himself. The root of religion is universal human nature. Historical religions are all one in virtue of this one common root. The unity of all religions must be sought in their universal element. The history of Protestantism is the history of the growth of free religion at the expense of Christian religion. As love of freedom increases, reverence for authority decreases. The completion of this religious protest against authority must be the extinction of faith in the Christian confession, that is, that the belief that Jesus was the Messiah. You can see how radical that became. Meanwhile, the Eastern Unitarians around at the same time found their statement in James Freeman Clarke's 5 points of Unitarianism, in contrast at that point to the 5 points of Calvinism, which were, and these are not in inclusive language, as you will see, 1, the fatherhood of God, 2, the brotherhood of man, 3, the leadership of Jesus, 4, salvation by character, 5, the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. But notice even in here how this is already leaning towards kind of a humanism and rationalism. But the struggle was also between the Western Unitarians, who were becoming more liberal, where humanism would start growing in the late 19th century, and the Easterners, where, of course, Boston was Mecca and the hub of the universe. There was the struggle between those who wanted to keep Christian language in there and more creedal statements and covenants, and those like former Transcendentalists and the Western Unitarians who didn't. as the 19th century drew to a close. The Unitarians and the Universalists were beginning to talk about a merger in the early part of the 20th century, and there was class distinctions as well as theological ones. The Universalists tended to be working class. They tended to have their churches in smaller towns, in blue-collar towns, and they oftentimes were looked down on by the Unitarians, who tended to be more upper class, more educated, etc. I think, of course, that religion should always be about building beloved community and helping to make the world a better place, about finding religious meaning in our lives and learning that love is what makes life worthwhile. Our Unitarian and Universalist heritage, which finally merged in this century, or in the end of the last century, brought us together, but we still have ways to go, as now we work on the idea of white supremacy and work on what's happening now in the country. So we come together to try to understand one another. So let us go in peace and learn more about ourselves as we can. Amen. Shalom, which means peace in Hebrew. Assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you in Arabic. Abrados a todos, hugs all around. Namaste, a Hindu greeting the divinity within me greets the divinity within you. Blessed be, and in Spanish they say, vaya con Dios. I say vaya con su Dios, which means go with your idea of God. And of course, abrados a todos, which means hugs all around. May it be so. Thank you. For the closing song, I want to share another song that comes from an old gospel song rewritten. This by another Unitarian named William Wolfe. And this was from a songbook from the old Los Angeles Unitarian Church, which, as I said, was founded by my great-great-aunt, Caroline Severance. When the bells tolled as the rolls called, and we mourn the loss of a friend, shall we wonder how much longer will our songs be heard or end? Will the circle be unbroken by and by and by? There's a better world born in if we try, if we keep faith with each other down a long freedom road. Every loved one, sister, brother, share each other's heavy load. Will the circle be unbroken by and by? There's a better world born in if we try, then the circle will be endless, and a new society will become a human circle in unbroken harmony. Will the circle be unbroken by and by? There's a better world born in if we try,
And now, as we extinguish this flame, we think of the words from Albert Schweitzer. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude for those who have lighted the flame within us.
The closing words are from the Lord's Prayer, translated by me. Spirit of love, times of all ages, times, names, and religion, may your name be so holy we don't have to debate it. May the peaceable kingdom come for all religions, and let love's will be done, here on Mother Earth as well as the universe. Help us to feed one another, food of the spirit and of the belly. And let us remember that since we wish to be forgiven of our faults, we must be forgiving of others. Help us overcome the temptation to treat people or the earth herself in harmful ways, for our selfish desires. For love and justice is the realm, the only good power, and the glory of the interdependent web of life of which we are a part. May we remember this, and may it be for all the generations of the earth to come, and may there be peace. Amen. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. May it be so. Go in peace.